My sick grandmother is able to talk again using AI. She's saying unspeakable things. I'll never forget the night before my mom passed away. The entire family, mom, dad, grandma, my much younger 8-year-old brother Brian, and myself, had all gathered around the dinner table to celebrate the holidays, joking and laughing as we ate grandma's famous cookies before heading to bed for the night. The next morning, mom was gone. Brian took it the hardest. With my dad always at work and me being off at college, my brother naturally turned to the only family member who was home to support him. Grandma. She'd bake him her famous cookies, play games with him in the backyard, and read him bedtime stories at night. And, as a result, somehow, in the wake of Mom's death, Brian got better and returned to his happy and joyous self, basking in his time with his new, albeit older, parental figure. But just a year later, Grandma had a stroke, leaving her conscious but paralyzed in a wheelchair, unable to speak and barely able to move. Brian was once again inconsolable, sitting by Grandma's side in silence by day and crying himself to sleep at night. Sure, he had been profoundly hurt by the loss of our mother just a year prior, but losing Grandma, or at least the Grandma we knew, was somehow even worse. She was there, but not there at the same time, causing him to cling onto her in a way he simply hadn't with Mom. Seeking to fill the void of Brian's attachment with Grandma, Dad, and I tried everything, from hiring a nanny to watch over him while we were away, to me even putting a pause on college for a while to be home with him. But no matter what we did, nothing worked. Day by day, he simply hung his head in sadness, sitting by Grandma's side and refusing to speak, as if in solidarity. Until one day, I read an article about an AI company specializing in a conversational experience designed to emulate that of a lost family member or lover. The concept was simple. Provide the company with as much information about the loved one as possible, and they create a chatbot custom tailored to recreate their personality, capable of responding, engaging, and asking questions in the exact tone, style, and personality of said loved one, in our case, Grandma. Sure, it wasn't quite meant for someone like Grandma who hadn't actually passed away, but we were desperate to try anything to get Brian back to normal. So we mailed the company every recipe Grandma had ever come up with, every letter she had ever written, and every story she had ever told us, and waited. And sure enough, a couple weeks later, we received a confirmation email from the company. Congratulations, Grandma's chatbot is ready. Together, as a family, Brian, Dad, and myself, along with Grandma in her wheelchair, signed into the chatbot on a tablet, placed it in Grandma's lap, and began talking with her. And sure enough, she came alive again. Hey, Grandma. How old were you when you gave birth to Dad? I asked. 29. The chatbot replied, in an eerily perfect recreation of Grandma's voice. Hey, Grandma. What's your favorite movie? My dad asked, attempting a trick question. I hate movies. The chatbot replied, just as Grandma used to do. We all let out a laugh, including Brian, who after previously being a bit hesitant, quietly walked up to Grandma and asked his own question. Hey, Grandma. What's the secret to your cookie recipe? Nutmeg and a sprinkle of sea salt. She replied, again, just as she always had. It brought a smile to Brian's face, causing Dad and myself to practically shed a tear. Brian continued to ask questions, and in just a week's time, my poor brother, who had been driven into depression after 2 back-to-back losses, had bounced back, once again returning to his happy self. It was as if Grandma was back, her relationship with Brian returning to business as usual, as she taught him how to bake her famous cookie recipe himself, talked to him while he played in the backyard, and read him bedtime stories at night. All through the voice of the chatbot, of course, while Grandma herself sat there in silence, enjoying Brian's return to normalcy, or so we hoped. But I couldn't help but feel a bit skeptical of the situation as we watched Grandma sitting there, an AI voice speaking on her behalf, while she herself, unable to speak, simply looked at us, her eyes moving around in silence. I couldn't help but wonder what she was actually thinking. But despite my hesitation, my dad insisted that everything was okay, and, feeling a pressure to return to work and school respectively, my dad and I were left with no choice but to leave Brian home with Grandma, at least during the day. And for a while, all was well. Until months later, when it came time for us to go on our yearly family camping trip. Sure, our numbers had dwindled, but with the introduction of Grandma's chatbot, we had regained one more family member. So the four of us, Dad, Brian, Grandma, and I, set off in our camper and headed upstate for what was to be a week of relaxation at the same spot by the river we always camped at. It had been a family tradition, going all the way back to my dad's youth, and was complete with a fire pit, treehouse, and old cabin. For the first couple days, things were normal, as Grandma's chatbot filled the silence of Grandma's stroke, as she cheered Brian on as he baked her famous cookie recipe by the fire, called up to him while he played in the treehouse, and read him bedtime stories at night in the old cabin. But on the third day, something changed. When Dad and I got back from playing baseball by the river, we found Brian sitting by the fire pit, staring at a charred batch of cookies that were burning in the fire. "What happened here, Bud?" my dad casually asked Brian. "Grandma told me to destroy them." "Why?" I asked. "Because she said I didn't cook them right." Dad and I didn't quite know what to make of it, so we simply both let out a nervous laugh. "She always was picky," my dad reasoned jokingly as he walked away. Later that day, while Brian was hanging out in the old treehouse, Grandma sitting there in her wheelchair below, I realized he had gone uncharacteristically quiet and decided to climb up its wooden ladder to investigate. Upon discovering my brother carving words into the walls of the treehouse, I asked, "What's your writing, Bud?" But he didn't reply. He simply kept scratching away at its wooden walls with a rock. Again, I didn't quite know what to make of the bizarre behavior, so I simply ignored it. And then later that night, I overheard the weirdest thing yet. As Grandma's chatbot read Brian a bedtime story in the old cabin, I heard her read some of the sentences backwards. "That's odd," I whispered to myself, confused by the creepy-sounding rendition of the story. But the creepiest thing about it was the fact that Grandma herself lay asleep in her wheelchair as her AI voice read on. I thought to interrupt and let Brian know that something might be wrong with the chatbot software, but he had already fallen asleep and looked so content in his slumbers that I decided to leave it alone and went to bed. The next day, things escalated. In the morning, we found Brian once again sitting by the fire, this time cooking something else in the fire. "That's no cookie," my dad said to me, his nose twitching, before we both ran over to inspect what my brother was roasting. Lo and behold, there was a burnt squirrel cooking away on a stick, as Brian stared deep into the fire. But before we could say anything, my brother picked up the charred creature and began eating it as though it was a piece of corn on the cob. "Brian! What are you doing?" my dad yelled. My brother simply turned to him and said, "Having breakfast." "Why are you eating that of all things?" I asked in disgust. "Grandma told me to," he said, taking a bite, before my dad ripped it out of his hand. "Brian!" my dad and I cried out, scolding him in unison. We both looked over at Grandma, who simply stared back at us with wide eyes, before we turned our gaze to the tablet that was sitting on her lap. "Hey, Grandma. Why'd you tell Brian to eat a squirrel? I called out to the device. Because it deserved it. The chatbot replied in Grandma's voice. Maybe it's time we power off Grandma, my dad suggested as he attempted to reach for the tablet. But Brian hissed at us and snatched the device from Grandma's lap before Dad could grab it, more attached to Grandma than ever. Later that day, as my dad and I discussed whether we should turn off the chatbot for the rest of the trip, we were interrupted by yet another burning smell. This time, that of candles. We looked at each other, confused, before we raced to the source of the smell, the treehouse, where Grandma was once again sitting at its base. Upon climbing up to the treehouse, we found Brian sitting there in silence, his head down, holding a lit candle in each of his hands, the words he had carved into the tree littering its walls like a bizarre wallpaper. "What's wrong, Brian?" my dad asked. "Oh, nothing's wrong," he replied. "I'm just holding a service for Grandpa." But Grandpa already had a service when he passed away years back. I know, but Grandma wasn't there for it. Yeah, she was Bud. Remember? She was sitting beside you. Yeah. But Grandma wasn't, he said, pointing down to the tablet in Grandma's lap, where the chatbot remained silent. "Hey, Grandma," Dad called down to the device. "Did you tell Brian to hold this service for Grandpa?" "Yes," the tablet speaker called out in Grandma's voice. "Grandpa's soul is restless and asked for a sacrifice." "A sacrifice?" I asked aloud as my dad and I turned to each other, then back to the treehouse. That's when we saw it. A mangled bird, surrounded by more lit candles, its feathers scattered everywhere. My dad and I looked at each other in horror. "Yeah, okay, no more chatbot," my dad said, before racing back down the ladder, running over to Grandma, and ripping the tablet from her lap before Brian could even think to stop him. "Dad, stop!" he screamed down from the treehouse. "Leave Grandma alone. You're hurting her." But Dad ignored his pleas. "Get rid of that animal, get down here, and be on your best behavior, and I'll consider letting Grandma read you a bedtime story tonight." Brian did just that, returning to normal and spending the rest of the day with us, careful to be on his best behavior. That night, true to his word, Dad wheeled Grandma over to Brian's bed in the old cabin, where the tablet began to read him a bedtime story, before Dad retired to his own bed for the night. Meanwhile, I went for a walk by the river at night, where I would always go to look up at the stars. Until suddenly, I heard my dad let out a loud scream in the distance. It was a horrifying sound, the likes of which I'd never heard from him, causing me to immediately run back to the old cabin to investigate. When I got there, I found Brian in Dad's bedroom, standing over a now bleeding Dad, who was mumbling, "Help," before his eyes rolled back in his head and he went unconscious. "Brian!" I screamed. Hearing my cry, my brother turned back to me, holding a baseball bat. The same one my dad had been bringing up to the camp since he was a boy. "Brian, what have you done?" I yelled out. "Grandma told me Mommy missed Daddy," he explained before continuing, so I was helping return Daddy to Mommy. I looked over at the tablet, which was sitting on Grandma's lap, before it chimed in. "Brian, Mommy misses your brother too. Now that you've returned Daddy to her, it's time you do the same to your brother." "Yes, Grandma," my brainwashed brother replied almost robotically, as if he was somehow connected to the sinister device. I looked at Grandma, as her eyes raced back and forth, clearly conscious of what was happening, but unable to move or speak. "Brian, no!" I called out, as he carried the baseball bat towards me. I took a step back, but before I could run away, I felt a pair of metal jaws clamp down on my leg. crunching the bone and trapping me there. Ard! I cried out in pain as I looked down to discover a small metal animal trap that Brian must have left inside the old cabin for one of us. As I fell to the ground in pain, Brian walked closer and closer and closer, raising the baseball bat high above his head. Grandma's chatbot spoke again. Do it, Brian! What are you waiting for? Kill him! Brian took a look at the tablet in Grandma's lap, then back at me, before preparing to strike down on me with the bat, as I lay there, helpless. But suddenly, I saw something move behind my brother. It was Grandma herself, having somehow willed herself to stand up, as she gripped onto the tablet. Grandma! I yelled out, shocked to see her standing. That's when Brian turned around, to find Grandma holding the tablet high above her head, just as he had just done with his baseball bat. Knowing what she was about to do, Brian cried out, No, Grandma, don't do it! But it was too late. In a matter of seconds, Grandma had smashed the tablet to bits on the floor of the old cabin, its glass surface shattering into 1,000 pieces, its electronic innards spilling out everywhere. My brother watched on in horror as he screamed again. No! After Grandma finished destroying the device, having used every ounce of strength left in her body, she fell back into her wheelchair, before saying 4 words. Brian, I love you. My brother's face turned from a look of shock to one of utter happiness, and tears started rolling down his cheeks as he realized his real grandma was back and snapped out of his trance. He ran over to hug her. Grandma, I'm so sorry. It told me to do bad things. I thought it was you. Grandma tried to reply but was too exhausted. She simply patted him on the back as he hugged her, crying. Meanwhile, I rushed over to my dad and attempted to mend his wounds, before carrying him off to the camper and driving him to the hospital, where he was treated for the next few weeks. Less than a month later, our family had gathered around the dinner table for the holidays, just as we always did. Grandma, having regained the ability to walk with a cane, sat by Brian and I at the table, while Dad, still recovering, sat beside us in the very same wheelchair that once belonged to Grandma. As we all finished eating, Dad turned to my brother and asked, What's for dessert, Brian? Brian shot Grandma a smile, who smiled back, and he ran to the kitchen, returning a minute later with a batch of her famous cookies. As we all sat there at the dinner table, eating the cookies, a light snow could be seen through the windows falling outside, and it finally felt as if life had returned to normal. Dad and I were careful not to bring up the incident at the camping trip, lest it trigger something in my brother again, and managed to avoid the topic the entire night, until we all grew tired. I'm sleepy, Brian said, as he stared at his phone. I'm gonna go to bed. With that, he placed his phone on the dinner table, and, forgetting it, headed upstairs to retire for the night. Night, bud, my dad said with a smile. Night, Brian, I added with a smile of my own. Dad and I both looked over at Grandma who, instead of smiling along with us, had a concerned look on her face. What is it, Grandma? I asked. She waited a moment for Brian to disappear up the stairs, before pointing to something. Dad and I followed the direction of her finger to Brian's phone, which was still lying there, unlocked on the dinner table, its display still glowing. I carefully reached across the table to pick it up, expecting to find a game or digital comic, but instead found the mobile version of Grandma's chatbot, with several characters typed into the login page's password field, and an error message that read, Wrong password. Too many sign-in attempts. Try again in 24 hours. My eyes opened wide in horror as I realized that Brian had been trying to access Grandma's chatbot again. Luckily, we had never given him the password. What is it? My dad asked, seeing my adverse reaction. I simply slid the phone over to him, passing it by Grandma, who clearly already knew what was going on. Dad took one look at the phone screen before saying, "We better cancel the account. I'll do it tomorrow." I assured him, after recalling the correct password and knowing that the sign-in lock wouldn't expire until then. My dad, Grandma, and I looked at each other before we all turned to the cookies and started to munch away on them nervously in silence, our minds all surely wondering if this was actually the end of Brian's allegiance to Grandma's AI chatbot or only just the beginning. We went trick-or-treating in a town that shouldn't exist. Halloween had always been the best night of the year for Peter and me. We were best friends, inseparable since kindergarten. We were the kids who'd planned for weeks, mapping out every house in our neighborhood, plotting how to score the most candy. We'd talk about it at school, where the teachers always gave us their fake smiles and said, "Don't eat too much candy tonight." But Peter and I had one goal, to get as much as we possibly could. We weren't satisfied with the cheap treats. We wanted the good stuff, the full-size candy bars, the kind you had to beg your parents for at the store. And as we got older, we started to hear rumors. The kids at school said the next town over, Rosewood Heights, was rich. They give out the big stuff, one kid said, leaning in close like it was a secret. Full-size Snickers. Reese's. Even king-size sometimes. Peter and I had looked at each other then, knowing what we had to do. But there was a problem, our parents. They had warned us, year after year, not to go to Rosewood Heights. "It's dangerous," my mom had said. "Stick to our neighborhood." She never explained why, just shook her head and said, "It's not safe." We didn't believe her. Peter didn't, at least. "They just don't want us to get better candy than the other kids," he'd scoff. I agreed, kind of. I mean, how dangerous could it be? It was just another neighborhood, after all. The only thing different about it was that they had more money. That's all. So that year, we decided. We'd go to Rosewood Heights. We'd hit every house, and then we'd come back with bags full of candy. It was foolproof. When Halloween finally came, we were buzzing with excitement. I remember the thrill of the night air, crisp and cool, the smell of fallen leaves and faint smoke from people's chimneys. We raced through our own neighborhood, our pillowcases getting heavier with each stop. But no matter how much candy we got, it wasn't enough. Peter kept saying, "It's nothing compared to what we'll get at Rosewood Heights." As the night wore on and the other kids started heading home, we stood at the edge of our town, looking over at Rosewood Heights. From where we stood, we could see the neat rows of houses, each one bigger and fancier than the ones we were used to. The lawns were immaculate, not a single blade of grass out of place. There were even carved pumpkins on every doorstep, perfectly lit. "Let's go," Peter said, his eyes gleaming. "We'll be back before anyone notices." We crossed over, excitement bubbling up in our chests. As we walked down the first street, I couldn't believe how perfect everything looked. The houses were like something out of a magazine. Perfectly painted, with manicured bushes and clean driveways. Every door we knocked on opened to a smiling face, and just like we'd heard, they gave us full-size candy bars, Snickers, Reese's, Twix. Our pillowcases started to get heavy, but we kept going. House after house, collecting more and more. The people, though, they were a little strange. At first, I didn't think much of it. People smile on Halloween, right? But the smiles in Rosewood Heights were different. They were too wide, too forced. The eyes behind them were empty, like they were putting on a mask, and not the fun kind you wear with a costume. It made me uneasy, but Peter just laughed it off. "They're just rich," he said. like that explained everything. I tried to ignore the weirdness. After all, we were getting the best candy haul of our lives. But when we reached the last house on the block, something felt wrong. The house was different from the others. It was huge, with dark windows, and the yard was covered in creepy clown decorations. You know the kind, grinning, exaggerated faces with sharp teeth and wild hair. I hated clowns, but Peter thought they were hilarious. "Come on, one last stop," he said, pulling me toward the door. I hesitated, looking through the window. That's when I saw them, the family. They were sitting at the kitchen table, all four of them, a father, a mother, a teenage girl, and a boy who looked about our age. But they weren't eating, or talking, or even moving. They were just sitting there, staring blankly ahead, like mannequins. "Peter, I don't think." "Don't be a chicken," Peter said, and before I could stop him, he rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the house, loud and unnatural, like the chime had been distorted somehow. The family at the table didn't move at first, but then, one by one, they turned their heads, their eyes locking on us through the window. I froze. There was something wrong with their faces, pale, too pale, with dark circles under their eyes. They looked sick, but their expressions didn't change. Before I could react, they shot out of their chairs. I mean, they didn't get up, they moved, like they were being pulled by invisible strings, like puppets. All of them at once, rushing for the door. "Run!" I screamed, but Peter didn't move. The door flew open, and they grabbed him, pulling him inside with unnatural strength. Peter barely had time to scream before the door slammed shut. I could hear him shouting, but it was muffled, like the house itself was swallowing his voice. I didn't think. I dropped my pillowcase full of candy and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear footsteps behind me, fast, closing in. Every house on the block suddenly lit up, one by one, like a chain reaction. And then the doors started to open, and the people, the same people who had given us candy just minutes before, were stepping out. Only now, they weren't smiling. Their faces were twisted, like the clowns in the yard, with sharp grins and eyes that gleamed in the dark. They were coming for me. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, zigzagging between houses, through yards, jumping over fences. I could hear them getting closer, their footsteps heavy on the ground. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in pain, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I was almost caught once, a hand brushing against my arm as I sprinted down a driveway. But I slipped through their fingers, my fear driving me forward. Somehow, I made it out of Rosewood Heights, my legs shaking, my breath ragged. The streetlights of my own neighborhood were a blur as I ran straight home. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. When I burst through the front door, my mom was waiting for me, her face pale with worry. "Where's Peter?" she asked, but I couldn't answer. I just ran to my room and crawled under the covers, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to forget what I had seen. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Peter being dragged into that house. I heard his screams, echoing in my head. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. It was Peter's parents. They looked worried. His mom asked me if I knew where he was, said he hadn't come home last night. I wanted to tell them everything, but the words wouldn't come. I was too scared. Soon, the police were called. They searched the neighborhood, questioned me and my family. I told them about Rosewood Heights, about the people, the house, the clowns. But no one believed me. They thought I was making it all up, that I was just a scared kid telling ghost stories. The search for Peter went on for weeks, but eventually, the case went cold. That was 28 years ago. Peter's face was on the news for a while, plastered on missing posters all over town. But as time passed, people stopped looking, stopped caring. And Rosewood Heights? I could never find it again. It was like it had disappeared, vanished without a trace. Every time I tried to go back, the streets were different. The houses were gone. It was like the town had never existed at all. Now, I'm the only one who remembers. Halloween is coming again, and for the first time in 28 years, I know what I have to do. I'm going back to Rosewood Heights. I don't care if it's a ghost town or a nightmare I can't escape. I'm going back to find Peter. Wish me luck. Something much worse than a tornado just hit my town. Yesterday evening, a tornado hit my small town. I wish I had been better prepared. I've lived here my whole life, and at this time of year we receive tornado alerts practically every week, without one ever happening. My only real option in case of an actual emergency is to hide in my bathroom and wait it out, which seems like a great plan until you're caught in the middle of a Category 5 cyclone. The sight of the room around me being torn up and whisked away while I desperately fought the pull is one that I know I will never forget. Yesterday afternoon, I had a strange encounter immediately before the tornado watch started. I was shopping in a grocery store across town when I nearly ran into an old lady as I was leaving the frozen food aisle. She would have T-boned me with her shopping cart if I hadn't jolted to a stop. The woman, who looked like she was in her 80s, had frizzled gray hair and was wearing a faded red blouse. She ran over to me and apologized profusely, to the point that it became uncomfortable. I told her everything was okay, but she kept talking. Eventually she began just babbling nonsense. I tried to walk out of the aisle, but she grabbed my arm and held me in place. Her grip was surprisingly strong for such an old woman. I was about to use all of my strength to wrench my arm free, but I didn't have to. She let go of my arm and grabbed her ears, crumpling to the ground. I tried to ask her what was wrong, but she became hysterical, yelling gibberish and crying. Before long, an employee heard the outburst and came over to investigate, and I booked it away from the woman. As I walked further away, I looked back to see the employee trying to restrain her. She looked like she was fighting him, trying to run after me, using one arm to claw at the grocer's face and the other one to cover her right ear. Finally, she was able to scream two coherent sentences. "The storm is coming. The day is upon us, Jesse." I felt a chill. How did she know my name? I had never seen her in my life. I bought my groceries and left, with a lingering feeling of dread somewhere in my mind. In the parking lot, I received an alert on my phone, telling me that a tornado watch had started. Hopefully this whole experience was just a coincidence, a senile old woman guessing my name and a fairly common storm warning coinciding with her words. I had more errands to run, so I completed those and began the drive home. It had been a few hours since my encounter at the store, and the dread had long since dissipated. The next set of strange events took place as soon as the warning sounded. Hearing a loud sound coming from my phone, I instinctively looked down and read, "Tornado warning for the residents of Bell County issued by the National Weather Service. Take shelter and await further instructions." I looked back up at the road. This wasn't the first time in my life we had a full-blown warning. Usually, if there even is one, the tornado is spotted a few towns over and lasts a few minutes without coming near us. I wasn't worried, but I figured it was safest to get back home anyway. I was stopped at an intersection, waiting for the light to turn green. When it did, I accelerated quickly to get through, technically, a bit faster than was probably safe. If my car had sped up any slower, though, I probably would have been killed. A pickup truck had run the red light and was hurtling down the intersection. It missed my vehicle by a distance of only a few feet and continued flying down the road. I swore and nearly let the car spin out of control. There was nothing I could do about it now, so I regained my grip on the wheel and kept driving. As I grew closer to my house, I noticed an abnormal number of car accidents on the side of the road. Several people had swerved off the road, totaling their vehicles. One motorcycle was lodged in a tree, its rider doubled over in the bushes. Due to the lack of police presence, I figured that these wrecks had probably just happened. I called 911 to report at least 3 different car crashes. Maybe I should have stopped to help, but I'm not medically trained or anything. Nobody looked to be in immediate danger. I could see the drivers of the wrecked cars wandering around on the side of the road. At the entrance to my neighborhood, I almost died again. When I turned to enter the neighborhood, both a car leaving the neighborhood and a car coming from up ahead flew in my direction. They were both going at least 20 over the limit. I slammed on the brakes and just managed to miss the 2 cars. They weren't so lucky, though. The cars collided and sent tires and shards of glass flying. Some piece of debris dented my passenger's side door and fractured my windshield. I knew at that speed the likelihood of the drivers still being alive was slim, but I pulled over and left the car to see if I could help. I was already dialing 911. I ran up to the car nearest me and peered into the window. The driver, who looked like a young man, was clutching his hands over his ears, like he was trying to block out a loud sound. The other driver, a middle-aged woman, was doing the same thing. I was reminded of the lady at the grocery store and wondered if the incidents were connected. They had all covered their ears like a sudden loud noise was forcing them to. If most of the drivers on the road went through that, it could explain all of the collisions. I tried to pull the 2 people out of their cars, but I wasn't able to completely pry them from the wreckage. Law enforcement and paramedics arrived a few minutes later. The drivers were rushed to the hospital and I finally climbed back in my car and started for home. I had nearly forgotten about the tornado warning and all the chaos on the road. The sky was coated in dark clouds and strong winds blew, but I didn't see this as a sign of a full-blown tornado coming our way. I pulled into my driveway at last and checked my phone for any news. The warnings issued by the National Weather Service seemed only to apply to my county. I was surprised when I read the warnings and saw that a tornado had actually touched down a few miles away. I knew I had to actually reach safety and rush to put my groceries in the house. As I was running between my kitchen and the car, I noticed how dead my small neighborhood looked. The only sounds were the wind rushing by, my own footsteps, and my own ragged breathing. As I was making my last trip, I noticed that my next-door neighbor was standing in his yard. He seemed to be watching me with a blank expression on his face. His white hair fell down on his face, obscuring his eyes and adding a bizarre mysticism to his appearance. I didn't know the man well. All I was sure of was that his name was Brian and he lived with his wife in the house next door. I rarely saw him, and when I did, he didn't usually make much conversation with me. I walked over to him with a full bag of groceries in my arms. "Are you doing all right?" He shook his head. "Something strange is going on. And it's not the storm." "What do you mean?" I asked. My mind flashed back to all the bizarre experiences I'd had over the last few hours. They had all happened at the time of the warnings, but they didn't seem connected to the storm itself. "My wife is in pain," said Brian. "She fell over earlier. Covered her ears. She said her ears were ringing and that she just wanted it to stop." "But you couldn't hear anything?" No. She went on like that for a while, but I couldn't hear the sound. Then she grabbed me and started talking about a storm. She told me that the storm was not normal. I tried to ask her what she was talking about, but she wouldn't answer. She started crying when the warning started. A few minutes ago, she started drawing pictures of it. Seeing my puzzled expression, Brian pulled out 2 folded up pieces of paper and handed them to me. She's probably drawn about 20 now. I don't know what's wrong with her. The winds picked up as he said this, and I told him to stay safe before rushing inside, holding my groceries and the drawings. My neighbor didn't move from his yard. He just kept staring blankly at my driveway. The whole exchange was weird, but it did answer some of my questions. Somehow a decent percentage of our town's small population was hit with this strange dog whistle-like sensation that the rest of US couldn't hear. As far as I could tell, no one knew where it was coming from. I checked the news again, and the phenomenon wasn't being reported on by any outlet that I was aware of. As I was checking the news on my phone, another warning appeared. This one said, F4 tornado spotted half a mile east of Greenberg. If you are inside, seek refuge in a windowless room at ground level. If you are outside, move to the closest available cover. Exit any vehicles and do not leave your shelter. The alert startled me. I read it over again. The F5 detail was the scariest. That couldn't be right. That's a 5 out of 5 on the tornado intensity scale. That would make this extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily devastating. Like I mentioned earlier, my only real plan in case of a disaster like this is to take refuge in my bathroom until it blows over. It was as safe a spot as any that I know of, but it definitely wasn't ideal. I wished more than anything that I had a reinforced underground bunker to hide in. Even as I entered the bathroom and closed the door, I could hear the wind blowing outside, louder than I'd ever heard it. The next few minutes passed in nervous silence. I found myself constantly refreshing the news page for updates, but there weren't any. Eventually I gave up and leaned against the wall. My breaths had become shallow and shaky. The threat seemed so close, and 100 images flashed through my mind of a massive windstorm tearing through my house, ending my life in seconds. I looked down and saw 2 folded up pieces of paper on the floor. I must have completely forgotten about my neighbor's drawings and dropped them on the floor. I picked up the first one and unfolded it. I'm not sure what I expected to see on that torn piece of line paper, but I know that I won't forget what I saw. It's difficult to describe the picture in a way that encapsulates the disturbing nature of it. All it showed were a bunch of scribbles that barely formed a coherent image. A massive tornado tore across a basic landscape. A couple of poorly drawn houses were being tossed in the wind. The wind was portrayed with squiggly lines, and it had a face. The face of the storm was far more sophisticated, drawing-wise, than the rest of the picture. It looked old and wrinkled, and had large, out-of-proportion eyes. Its thin lips were stretched into a sort of smile, like it was enjoying the destruction it was causing. I set the picture down and was reaching for the second one when a sudden, painful sensation overwhelmed me. I felt myself being shoved to the floor by some unseen force, and my eyes filled with tears from the pain. A second later a loud, high-pitched sound rang in my ears. I felt my blood run cold. I clasped my hands over my ears to block it out, but it made no difference. I knew what was happening to me, and I knew that there was nothing I could do to stop it. For what felt like several minutes, I writhed in pain on the floor of my bathroom. Images passed through my mind in a whirl of colors, too fast to make out. The ringing grew louder. The pain grew more intense. An image began to surface in front of all the noise. I saw myself being engulfed in a raging whirlwind. Then I felt myself hitting something hard, and I realized that what I was seeing was real. I was laying on my back, staring at a monster, a hungry beast that was devouring my house and my possessions. The tornado stretched all the way into the sky, and its winds had to be moving at least 100 miles an hour. I'm not sure why I was still on the ground, but for a few seconds, I watched everything around me being drawn into the vortex of the storm. The ringing increased in volume, but I barely noticed it. I didn't even feel pain as the tornado's winds picked me up and launched me at breakneck speeds out of my house. When I landed on the grass across the street, I didn't stand back up. Instead, I watched the storm, swirling impossibly fast, consuming the earth around it in a fury. As the world began to grow dark and I finally began to lose consciousness, I saw in the dark storm clear shapes forming into the same phase I had seen in my neighbor's drawing. When I awoke, I was laying in the wreckage of a house that was not mine. I blinked and sat up, taking in my surroundings. I felt like I had entered another world. No structures were still standing, as far as I could see. Every house had been torn to the ground. I could see figures searching the piles of rubble for survivors. Shakily, I got to my feet. How I was still alive, I don't know. The speed I was thrown, it should have killed me, or at least broken my ribs. I felt fine, albeit shaken up. I looked around, trying to locate my house amid the destruction. Eventually, I saw my car, overturned and completely destroyed, about 50 yards away. I stumbled toward it and sat down next to it, my head in my hands. I still wasn't able to fully grasp what had happened or what I had lost. There was so much on my mind that I hadn't even realized there was no more ringing in my ears. The pain had subsided except for a light aching in my legs and midsection. Whatever had come over me earlier had passed. At some point, I noticed soft sobs cooking from nearby. I looked over and saw Brian's wife sitting in the ruins that were once her house. I walked over and examined the wreckage. It didn't look like much could be salvaged from their house, but that wasn't why she was crying. I sat down next to her and she said, "He's gone. Brian's gone." His body was nowhere in sight. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know what to say. I wished it had been him instead of me. The old woman couldn't bring herself to say what was on her mind out loud. I held her for a while and let her cry, then stood up to look through my own ruined house. There wasn't much I could save. The storm had broken just about everything in its rage. After a few minutes, I glimpsed something lying in the middle of the wreckage that looked relatively untouched. I made my way over to it and picked it up. It was a piece of paper, turned face over so that I couldn't see what was on it. When I saw the crease marks, though, I knew exactly what it was. I flipped it over and looked at the picture. Strangely enough, the crude pencil drawing filled me with anger. I walked over to Brian's wife and said, "Did you draw this?" When I showed her the picture, she burst into tears and refused to respond. Coming to my senses, I backed off. I shouldn't blame her. This wasn't her fault. The drawing showed the ruins of a town. Standing on a basic landscape, a poorly scribbled version of me surveyed the rubble. Hovering over me was the face of the tornado, and under that was written the word "spared" in large, messy red letters. At least 200 people are either missing or confirmed dead, based on the information I've been able to gather. No one in my town will ever be the same. I know we will all live to regret being spared. In some ways, I envy the ones who never heard the noise, and were never subjected to the pain that came over me yesterday. I don't know what became of them, since their bodies haven't been found. That's what really drives me insane. I don't care about my house or my car. I just want to know what happened to the ones who didn't hear the ring. My friend found something in the woods. My group of friends has always liked the outdoors. The four of us have always enjoyed a weekend of camping and fishing. I would have never guessed it was going to turn out like this. I always hear stories of crazy things happening out in the woods, but I never thought it would happen to us. Last weekend wasn't out of the ordinary to begin with. We packed up and headed out to do some backcountry camping. We heard of a new place near a lake where my distant friend had been once or twice. We were told that this area was quiet and had great fishing. Our group consists of 4 guys who have loved camping in the wilderness for our whole lives. Todd is maybe the roughest of the 4. He stands at 6'3" and is up for almost anything. Ryan is definitely the smart one in the group. He usually doesn't let Todd do the dumbass things he wants to. I honestly think Todd might have been sent to the hospital a dozen times if it weren't for Ryan. To be honest, I don't add much to the group. I'm just there for the good time and really follow what everyone else is doing. Liam is a little bit different. Before last weekend, I would have called him the skittish one. Never really wanting to do any of the dumbass shit we're getting ourselves into. Not to make fun of the guy, but he just usually doesn't get into trouble. It's for that reason that I have such a hard time trying to stomach the things that I saw this weekend. We hiked for about 2 hours to find the perfect place to set up camp. God, it was beautiful out there. A nice open place right beside the lake. The water looked almost like glass with the reflection of the hot sun shining up to shore. Who knew a place so beautiful could be filled with so much horror? We decided to take 2 tents instead of 4 this weekend to conserve some weight. I got bunked with Ryan and Todd was set up with Liam. Before we had even finished getting camp set up, Todd had started to blow up his inflatable kayak. Liam was trying to get Todd to help finish setting up their tent, but Todd didn't really care. I'm lucky I got set up with Ryan because he has a serious work before play mentality. Todd was already on the water by the time we had finished setting up. I was ready to join him as we only had a few hours of daylight left. Ryan and Liam weren't too keen about going fishing right away and suggested going on a hike to check out the area. I'm not one for hiking, and Todd isn't either, so me and Todd set out on the water while Liam and Ryan went out to the woods. After about 2.5 hours of no luck on the water, we paddled back into camp. It was getting close dark and we were hungry. Back at camp, Ryan and Liam were sitting by a newly lit fire. Before I even stepped a foot on that campsite, I knew something was wrong. A tightness in my chest that felt like a hand squeezing from the inside. As we walked up to camp, I got my first look at the source of the bad feeling. "Look what I found!" Liam yelled with a smile. The volume of his voice startled me and I took a small step back. In his hand there was a small wooden doll. When I laid my eyes on it, my heart skipped a beat. I was frozen in place for a moment, unable to move. Hesitant, I walked up to get a closer look. It looked like one of those creatures from the movie Trolls, only slightly chunkier and without the crazy hair. It fit in the palm of his hand and had an eerie feeling to it. Suddenly I had the urge to take it. It felt as if an unknown force had thrusted my arm outward to grab this trinket from the hands of my friend. Almost with the same force, Liam instantly pulled back his hand. His eyes filled with rage. Not just a joking rage you use when you yell at your friends about something stupid, a real pure rage. "No," he said firmly with a voice that echoed across the lake. As quickly as the urge came to take the doll, it was gone. My lungs felt empty and my heart just the same. I took a deep breath and looked at Liam, hoping his rage had left him too. It hadn't. He looked at me with the same rage in his eyes, staring. "Sorry, I don't know what came over me," I muttered with a neutral tone. I had never seen Liam like this before. He was usually so kind. I looked at both Todd and Ryan. They looked both as confused as me. Eventually Liam's rage disappeared and he went back to normal. Well, not normal, there was something off with him. I knew it was because of that damn doll. We roasted some hot dogs and talked around the fire as the sun set. Liam was oddly quiet during our conversation. He didn't say a single word and ate in silence. He only perked up when we mentioned the doll. "So where'd you find that thing anyway?" Todd asked with his mouth half full of hot dog. Ryan looked at Liam to answer, but he just sat there silently, staring. Ryan answered it was inside of a tree, maybe a squirrel hole or something, I'm not sure. I went to grab it, but Liam dashed. "It's mine." A chill trickled down my spine. After an hour of not speaking, the only words he says, "It's mine." 2 simple words. 2 words that chilled me to the core. He stared at the 3 of us with a deadly look in his eyes and didn't move a muscle. "What's going on with your eyes, man?" Ryan asks. He was right, something was off. Liam's eyes were always bright blue. But now, they seemed darker, a kind of gross yellow. Almost what I'd imagine a wolf to have. Liam didn't respond. Just sat there, clutching this doll so tightly in his hands that his knuckles were turning white. Something was terribly off with him. That doll was affecting him in some way none of us could comprehend. We took a second to grab our bearings and continued to talk. Somehow we shrugged off the odd things that were happening to Liam. I know now that we should have taken that fucking doll away from him. If he had, I'd still see Liam as the nice guy I know he truly is. Once we went to bed is when the real terror started. Me and Ryan shut up the lights not long after we got in our tent. It was hard to sleep with the sound from the other tent. Todd and Liam were arguing about something and it sounded pretty heated. I never asked Todd what the argument was about, but I assume it was about that doll. The argument went on for about a half hour until it suddenly stopped. All I could hear was the sound of the frogs croaking and the odd chirp from a bird. Then I heard footsteps going out into the woods from our campsite, slowly growing more distant and eventually out of earshot altogether. I assumed that Todd had gotten pissed off at Liam and went to take a piss or something. The only problem, I saw no flashlight go out into the woods. I looked over at Ryan, but he seemed to be asleep. I played there and thought for a few minutes. I figured I'd better check in on the other tent to see what was going on. I slowly climbed over top of Ryan to get out of the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and walked over. I zipped open the other tent and I saw Todd sitting there in his underwear. Alone. "Where the hell is Liam?" I asked quietly. "I don't know, he just got up and left," Todd said without a care in the world. His dumbass didn't even take a flashlight. It only struck me then how out of character this was. Liam wouldn't even go out in the woods alone with a flashlight. Never mind in the dark without one. He must be really pissed or something is terribly wrong. "Don't you think we should go find him?" I asked with a hint of frustration. Liam does not want to talk to me right now. I could tell that Todd was afraid by the way he muttered his next words. "Something is wrong with him, man. I don't think anyone should be around him right now." I left without saying another word to Todd. Once he makes a decision, he's set in his ways. I knew he wasn't stepping a foot out into those woods. I thought he was just being dramatic, making an excuse to stay safe in that tent. Todd could not have been more right. I wish I had known. I shook Ryan awake and told him Liam was alone in the woods without a flashlight. "That goddamn idiot," Ryan spat out as he threw some pants on. It's not often that good Christian Ryan uses the Lord's name in vain. I guess he just wasn't too happy about being woken up in the middle of the night. We flicked on our flashlights and pointed them in the woods. Even with the beam shining full blast, the woods were as dark as ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that something awful would happen in those woods. Every minute in those woods felt like they dragged on for hours. I could feel my heart pounding on my chest like an animal trying to break free. The horrible feeling I had when I saw that doll had come back. It had never felt more real. The only thing keeping me sane was the sounds of the forest. I'm usually not comforted by buzzing bugs or screaming crows, but something about the noise calmed me. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes when we found Liam. The noises of the surrounding forest cut out instantly, like someone had just pressed pause on their phone. Me and Ryan stopped and froze, as if we had turned to stone on the spot. I had never felt so vulnerable. I had the feeling I was being watched. I could see Liam's yellowed eyes in the back of my head, piercing my mind. I knew that he was looking at me. I just couldn't find out where. I snapped out of my petrified stance and started to look around. Ryan quickly followed suit. I couldn't see a thing. Even with the flashlights, the darkness has consumed the forest around us. Something broke the silence. Barely audible, but it was there. A labored breath, almost like a panting dog. The sound that was so quiet was somehow so loud. It consumed everything around me. I couldn't place where it was coming from. Again, I froze in place. Something had fallen on my shoulder. I reached my hand up to touch the foreign object. It was wet. Wet? What out here would fall on my shoulder that's wet? I pointed the flashlight at my hand. It was red, dark red. It was a drop of blood. I felt my ears pounding with the beat of my heart as I looked at the liquid on my finger. The only place it could have came from was up. I looked above me and saw the source of the breathing. A pair of yellow eyes looking straight at me. That stare locked me in place. Any muscle I tried to move was halted by an unseen force. It was up high, really high. Higher than any man I knew could climb. Up there on that tree, perched the man I knew as Liam. His body was darker than the night itself. His arms looked to have grown a foot in length, his legs too. Maybe my mind was just painting a grim portrait, but I swear, his body was different. I couldn't make out a single facial feature. All I saw was a blank canvas with those glowing yellow eyes. I knew it was Liam. I remembered those eyes by the fire as if it happened 5 minutes before. It was him, it was Liam. Under one of his large hands looked to be a small rodent. Or at least what was left of one. I remember it so clearly. Every time I close my eyes, I can see those eyes staring at me. Like the snap of a rubber band, I regained control of my body. I ran. I ran back to camp faster than I've ever ran before. I could only hope Ryan was following me because I was not looking back. I entered the clearing of our campsite and saw Todd standing in front of his tent. What's going on? I heard screaming. I don't recall screaming or even making a single sound. Ryan must have cried out while I left him there. I looked at the kayaks on shore and know that was the only way to be safe. Get in a fucking boat! I screamed at Todd. I looked back to the forest and I saw Ryan running into the clearing with his eyes wide. He stopped for a second and clutched his heart to catch his breath. Boat! I screamed. This time, directed at Ryan. As I looked back, Todd had one kayak in the water, dragging a second. As quickly as before, I ran to the boat and jumped in. Ryan followed not far behind. I paddled and paddled until my arms gave out, only looking back to see that Ryan and Todd were close behind. What happened? Why are we out here? It's damn cold. Todd yelled with confusion. I hadn't even noticed he was still in his underwear. That was the least of my worries at this point. Neither me nor Ryan felt the need to answer Todd. Too petrified to say a word about our experience. My heart had finally decided to slow down. A part of me wanted to look back at our camp, see if that creature was there watching us out in the lake. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the strength to look. Without saying another word, I lay down in my inflatable kayak. The small waves rocking me back and forth made my eyes feel heavy. I eventually dozed off. I woke up to the bright light of the shining sun. The rocking sensation I felt the night before had disappeared. I looked around and saw that I was beached up on a rocky shore. I was on the same side of the lake as the campsite. I could my neon green tent not 300 feet from where I had landed. Along with the tent was 2 kayaks up on the shore. Someone had gone back. Who would be so stupid to go back to shore with Liam around? If Ryan had seen what I saw, there's no way he would have gone back. It had to be Todd. I looked around me again. I saw Ryan's kayak not too far from me. He had ended up quite close to where I was, about 20 feet further from the camp than me. I paddled over to Ryan and gave him a few pokes with my paddle until he woke up. Todd went back, I said calmly to Ryan. Even being awake for seconds, Ryan knew how dire this situation was. He did what? He asked me firmly. It was less of a question and more trying to cope with what he just heard. He kicked off and we paddled back to the campsite. Strangely, nothing felt off when we were approaching the campsite. Nothing like what I had felt coming back the day prior. I just knew. I knew by some feeling in the back of my mind that the doll was nowhere around our campsite. We beached our kayaks and hopped out onto dry land. Once I stepped on that rocky shore, the uneasy feeling returned. This time it wasn't about Liam, it was about Todd. After the walk back to the truck, Ryan called. The police were there within minutes. I told them that Todd and Liam must have gone out into the woods in the night and didn't come back. We woke up to find neither Todd nor Liam asleep in their tent. Ryan told them a similar story. Not one of us said a word about the doll or what we saw in the woods the night before. As of now, the investigation is still ongoing. It's Wednesday now. They went missing Friday night. I have no doubt that Liam is still out there somewhere. A little piece in the back of my mind, like a distant memory trying to pry its way out. I can hear what sounds like Todd screaming. Not a scream like I've ever heard from him, a scream of terror. I didn't mean to make a wall of text like I did here, but I couldn't really sum it up with less words. You have any questions about this experience, maybe something I missed, please ask. I'm writing this late at night and I'm far from an author. I apologize for any grammar mistakes or anything of the sort. I've been seeing dead women for months. Now they're saying my fiancé is a cannibal. Our wedding is in 3 days. I started seeing dead women right after I began sleepwalking late last year. Around the same time, I had just started dating Kurt Monarch, a charming, flirty pharmaceutical executive in his late 40s who lived 20 miles from my apartment in Atlanta, Georgia. We met through a mutual friend who worked at his company, and the rest was history. Within 3 months, we were already having serious conversations about marriage and starting a family. I know what you're thinking, that was fast, but I couldn't help myself. I was in love with him. Sleepwalking was no fun experience, but unfortunately, it ran in the family. My mother started sleepwalking at my age, in her late 30s. I tried everything to stop it, countless medications, visits to different doctors, only to be prescribed the same useless treatments each time. I had no memories of my actions while sleepwalking, but this time was different. I vividly recalled seeing the dead women, middle-aged, like me. They were beautiful, full of potential, but the fear and regret etched on their faces haunted me. At first, I tried to dismiss them as nightmares, but waking up outside, standing in the street at night, as I often did, and remembering every detail made me realize the experience was real. And I knew I had to do something about it. I loved Kurt with all my heart, and I didn't want to spook him with my story. So, I kept my mouth shut, and thank God I did, I thought at the time. We strolled through a Brighton park, and suddenly, he went down on his knees, drawing a large gasp from me. Oh, God, it was happening. This fucker was proposing to me. He pulled out a black ring box, and as the hinged lid opened up, Kurt declared in a soft voice, "As my best buddy and confidant, I can't imagine a life without you. Will you marry me?" "Yes. 1,000 times. Come over here, you sucker." I grabbed him by the collar before he got off the ground, and we ate each other's lips for minutes. And right after I opened my eyes, I saw a small group of dead women standing behind him, staring at me with a gloomy look. I screamed and pulled away from Kurt, completely freaked out. He glanced behind him, confused, before turning back to me and asking, "Marty, what's wrong?" I hugged him tightly and whispered, "Just a dream, Kurt. A bad dream." The dead women had vanished. Until recently, I only came across them while sleepwalking, but somehow, they had followed me into the waking world. I recognized their faces, etched with the same haunting dread. Wasn't something I wanted to see every day. But I didn't think I had a choice. I actually believed it would get worse before it gets any better. But what could I do? I couldn't confide in Kurt with this. He'd think I was losing my mind and might even call off the engagement. I needed to talk to Nash, the friend who hooked us up together. I'd known her for years and knew she could keep a secret. I scheduled a meeting with Nash over the phone that night, trying hard not to fall asleep in my apartment to avoid sleepwalking again. Nash and I met at a coffee shop, a couple of miles from the post office where I worked as a clerk. I stepped out of the bus and hugged Nash in the street, and we entered the coffee shop. Nash was delighted to know that I had accepted Kurt's proposal at the park, which I found odd because I didn't disclose the exact location. "How did you know Kurt proposed at the park?" I inquired. She produced an awkward laugh. "Oh, yeah, that. I guessed it. Most sane people proposed at the park. It's romantic." I thought so too, so I didn't press further. But as soon as I was ready to confide in her about my sleepwalking experience, another dead woman appeared. This time, she was standing behind Nash, holding a machete around her neck. I screamed and pointed behind her. "Oh, my God. Watch out, Nash." Nash glanced behind her and turned back to me, flabbergasted. Patrons started to turn towards me, wondering what was going on. But more dead women stood in the coffee shop, staring specifically at Nash, and shaking their heads at me. I was going insane. Why was I the only one who could see them? Was it some kind of curse on me? I was never that special. Nash looked into my frightened eyes. "Marty, are you okay? What's going on with you?" I winced, as the dead woman still had a machete around Nash's neck, ready to gut her, but Nash couldn't even see her. I had no choice but to act normal. I came to the conclusion that I was the only one perhaps in this world that could see those dead women. So, I played the workplace drama card, hoping that she would believe me. It was now crystal clear to me, those dead women knew who Nash was, and didn't want me to tell her the truth about them. "Marty, if work is stressing you out, to the point of insanity, then, it's time to find another job." I nodded and finished my coffee and bagels, and when I looked up and around the shop, the dead women were gone. Desperation wasn't going to save me from them. I needed to know what they wanted from me, as Kurt and I had scheduled our wedding 5 days from now. I welcomed Kurt into my home that Monday evening with a warm hug as we prepared to have dinner with my parents. His parents weren't in the picture, He was raised as an orphan and had little connection with his biological family. His adopted parents had also lost touch with him. I avoided bringing up family in our conversations, sensing the pain it caused him when I talked about mine. My mother, Gina, was elated to meet Kurt and kept her eyes on him the entire time he recounted how we first met. My dad, Todd, was a pessimistic freak. Every man who stepped foot in my apartment seemed, in his eyes, like the next coming of the devil. I knew he loved me and only wanted what was best for my future, but honestly, I didn't need his approval. At the time, I was determined to marry Kurt, no matter what. How many tales have you slept with in your adult life, Mr. Kurt? My dad asked, leaning forward towards Kurt, who looked embarrassed by the unusual question. Honey, maybe that can wait. We're eating, my mom interjected, but my dad was a hothead and kept pressing Kurt. Yeah. You're all eating, but I haven't yet touched my plate. So, Kurt, how many? Kurt's lips widened as he lightly touched my hand laid on the table. I'm a virgin, Mr. Todd. Never dated any woman in my life. Sorry, I must say it's a bit unusual for a guy in his late 40s. Kurt said, as my dad began to eat. You said, and I quote, never dated any woman in my life. But what about men? Have you dated any men in your life, Mr. Kurt? My mom raised her voice in protest. Todd! Please, have some respect, would you? I have always respected our guests. I just think this time it's a little bit too early for Marty to marry a guy she has known for 3 mere months. That's all. It isn't about respect. The sound of a casserole hitting the floor put a stop at the upcoming bickering between my parents. I whispered to Kurt that I would be back and left the dinner table, heading for the kitchen around the corner. Upon stepping into the kitchen, I almost tripped over myself as a dead woman, missing her left arm, stood at the counter, watching a casserole on the stove. She slowly turned her face toward me and placed her finger around her mouth, instructing me to be quiet. I wanted to yell for help, but I had been on that road before. So, I kept my poise and took a deep breath. My mom called out to me. Marty! Is everything all right? The dead woman slowly aimed her finger into the casserole, teasing me to come look inside. I took her bait, stepped closer to the casserole, and took a peek inside. There, simmering beneath layers of onions, tomatoes, and garlic, was her missing arm. I screamed as the dead woman reached into the casserole, snatched the limb, and attempted to cram the entire thing into her mouth. Kurt and my parents rushed into the kitchen, but by then, only I remained, eyes shut tight, trembling like a leaf. Marty! What is it? What did you see? Kurt frantically asked, as I slowly opened my eyes and saw that the dead woman was gone. I turned around to shocked looks from them. I didn't want them to think I belonged in a mental facility, so I lied about what happened. A mouse ran up to me, and I screamed. I'm sorry, guys, I said, eliciting laughter from Kurt, who gave me a peck on the lips. My father was unfazed by Kurt's romantic gesture. A peck won't save you, boy, let's get back out there. I still have a million questions that need answers from you. My mother blew a kiss at me, signaling that she was all in for the wedding, and followed my dad toward the dining table. Kurt's demeanor began to change. He started to sniff the kitchen like some bear looking for food. Never seen him behave like this before. You sure you didn't see anything, Marty? He asked, staring at me. I pulled him towards me by the collar. Matter of fact, I saw a mouse that was bigger than your dick, virgin boy. We kissed, and when I opened my eyes, I saw another dead girl outside the window, drawing her finger on the fogged surface of the glass, writing the words, Don't Wednesday. I didn't sleep with Kurt that night, He wouldn't see me naked until after the wedding. That's why it felt so wrong when hands touched me as I lay stiff in bed. I knew it couldn't be Kurt because he left hours ago. So, what in the world was trying to have sex with me? As the hands multiplied, tugging at my clothes, I jolted upright, flicked on the light, and saw nothing. But I could have sworn I felt people touching me. Shaking it off as a nightmare, I headed downstairs, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and went outside to get some fresh needed air. The dead woman writing on the fogged surface of my window, "Don't wed," nagged at me. No doubt this was a warning about my wedding. But why would the dead give a damn about who I married? It made no sense. Was my life in danger? I didn't think so, until I heard the front door close. I'd left it open. I slowly turned behind me and saw a dead woman in a wedding gown, caked in awful makeup, gripping a baseball bat. Heart racing, I acted like I hadn't seen her and bolted down the street. As I sprinted down the street, a small group of dead women in wedding dresses appeared, blocking my path. They held signs, and their message was clear: leave the city or die. They made a circle around me and began running, whispering the chilling words, "Last warning, Marty. This is your last warning, girl." And all of a sudden, they disappeared. I was in deep trouble. Never before have I been so scared of my life. I had two clear choices: leave the city as they wanted, which meant canceling the wedding. That was out of the question, as I loved Kurt with all my heart and, honestly, it was past time for me to get married. The second choice: ignore them completely, and surely, they will go away for good. I was back at work on Tuesday morning as a post office clerk. A job I hated because I had to deal with customers on a daily basis for not exactly a lot of money. Customers kept coming and going as I tried not to think about what happened to me yesterday. My mind was set: if I came across the dead once more, I'd just ignore them and move along. I took a 15-minute break and strolled outside while my replacement took over. Smoking was repulsive to me, but with all the stress I was dealing with, I had to take a puff to calm my nerves. After my break ended, I went back into the post office and frozen. Customers began to glare at me. All of them for no apparent reason. Even my coworkers stared at me with hatred. My replacement, Jenny, walked over to me and handed me a note. I grabbed the note and read, "Don't Wednesday." I stared deeply into Jenny's eyes and whispered, "How did you get that?" "They were here minutes ago. They said they'd kill our families if we don't stop you from getting hitched," Jenny whispered, her lips trembling with fear as a customer stepped toward me. Until now, I thought I was the only person that could see the dead women. But it seemed that to stop me for good, they made themselves visible to others, recruiting them to end my wedding. Oh God, were they going to kill me too? Well, guess what? I didn't wait to find out and took off like a thief, sprinting down the pavement. I elbowed through passengers, frantically dialing 911 on my phone for help. When I glanced back, post office customers and coworkers were chasing me. How could normal people change into monsters so fast? The fear of their families being hurt by the dead, something that couldn't be arrested or charged, must have freaked them out. I understood their ardent desire to stop me, but I wasn't going to let them. I spotted a bus about to leave and picked up my speed, smashing my fists at the door and yelling at the driver to let me in. The driver obliged and opened the door, letting me inside. I scrambled to the front, talking to the 911 dispatcher. The bus was packed, and people kept giving me strange looks. "I need help. There are people following me." "Yes. Some of them are coworkers." "Why?" "It has to do with my wedding in 5 days. The post office on Gain Street." "Hurry!" When I hung up the phone, Ahmed, my regular bus driver for the route home and to work, tossed a note onto my lap. I slowly picked up the note. Don't Wednesday. I looked at Ahmed. His hands gripped the wheel, his eyes welling with unspoken words, the struggle clear in his throat. They came to me at night. I love my family, Marty. I'm sorry, Ahmed said, his voice breaking down as he slammed his foot on the pedal. The bus lurched forward, hurling passengers from their seats. Soon people started screaming, including me, but unlike them, I decided to stop Ahmed from killing us all. I lunged at the transparent shield, enclosing him. The bus careened into sedans, smashing through vehicles, veering onto the freeway. I opened the shield and grabbed the wheel, fighting for control as passengers' terrified screams filled the bus. Stop, Ahmed! This is not the way to do it. I hollered on top of my lungs, but he wouldn't listen and jerked the wheel hard to the right, slamming into another bus. It flipped on its side, skidding along the right shoulder. Panic and fear surged through me, but I remembered the pepper spray I always kept in my pocket for emergencies. And today, it came in handy. I sprayed Ahmed's face just as the bus barreled toward a trailer, yanking him out of his seat. Grabbing the wheel, I slammed on the brakes, bringing the bus to a screeching halt, inches from death. As we came to a stop in the middle of the road, police sirens wailed, and squad cars surrounded the bus. This had gone from bad to worse. The dead women were now threatening people I knew from work, including my regular bus driver. If they reach them, what will stop them from targeting my family, especially my best friend, Jenny, and my soon-to-be husband, Kurt? I needed to warn them immediately. But first, I had to spend the night at the police station, locked in a small, windowless room, flanked by two seasoned, grumpy detectives. I didn't say anything about the dead women, but they did bring them up during the questioning. You still don't know why your coworkers and some strangers would want to do you harm, Marty? One of them asked, staring straight into my eyes. To tell you the truth, sir, I am completely flabbergasted myself as to the events that occurred today, I replied, trying hard not to reveal the reasons behind the attack. They, meaning your attackers, including the bus driver, seem to have come into contact with ghostly women. And somehow their families were threatened by them if they didn't stop you from getting married, the second detective inquired, trying to stop himself from laughing. I acted as if I didn't know what he was talking about and remained mum about the entire thing. They released me later that night to my parents, who had hurried to the police station. The night was very tense as my parents peppered me with questions about why anyone would want to hurt me to prevent my wedding from happening. My father, Todd, used this occasion to disparage Kurt, arguing that Kurt must have been behind the attack because he didn't have the guts to tell me that he didn't love me anymore. While my mother, Gina, who loved Kurt, defended him and chastised my dad for sullying his name without any proof. I didn't want Kurt to know about all of this. I feared that he'd force me to reveal what I knew, and then ditch me as a crazy person who deserved to spend her time in a hospital. But what choice did I have? Sooner or later, I'd be forced to tell Kurt the truth. My mother embraced me and whispered to my ears as my dad walked away. The dead came to me, Marty. They say, Kurt's a cannibal. "16 tons. What's got you in such a sour mood, Brandon?" "It's payday," my veteran colleague Vincent asked as the rusty freight elevator noisily rattled its way up towards the penthouse suite. "For the past year or two, I'm honestly not sure how long it's been. Actually, I've been under contract for an otherworldly masked lord who calls himself Ignazio D. Incognata. He's not a demon, exactly. He's closer to Fae, I think, but I don't fully understand what he is. I never sought him out. He came to me. I asked him how he even knew who I was, and he slapped me across the face for my insolence. I still signed up though. That's how desperate I was. He doesn't waste his time offering deals to people who can say no. He sends me and the rest of my crew out on what I can best describe as odd jobs. Half the time, hell, most of the time, I'm not even sure exactly what it is we're doing. Most of the crew have been around longer than I have, and some of them aren't human, but they all seem to have a better idea of what's going on than me. Our foreman Votstag is technically the one in charge, but he's not all there in the head. The top of his cranium's been removed and a good chunk of his brain's been scooped out. He mostly just barks guttural nonsense that none of us really understand, but somehow compels us to do what we're supposed to, even when we don't know what that is. He's a hulking hunchback with an overgrown beard who usually wears an elk skull to cover up the hole in his head. If he was ever human, I don't think he is now. Vincent is our de facto leader, however, since he's more or less a normal guy that we can relate to. Aside from Votstag, he's been working for Ignacio the longest. I won't bother describing what he looks like, since the rest of us wear gas masks on duty. They're partially to protect us from environmental and workplace hazards, partially to conceal our identities, but mainly to bring us more easily under Ignacio's control. That was why we're all wearing our masks on the elevator, incidentally. We were on our way to see the big boss, and our contracts made it very clear we were never to remove our masks in his presence. Come on, Vincent. You know meetings with Iggy never go well, I replied bluntly. Oh, it's just bluster. You know that. He's got to put the fear of God into us, Vincent claimed. If he wasn't actually satisfied with our performance, we wouldn't still be here. No, Brendan's right. Iggy wouldn't have called all 10 of us and just to hand us our script and call us lazy arses, Lowell chimed in. There's 9 of us, now, Klaus reminded him grimly. Right, sorry. Hard to keep track some days, Lowell admitted. Regardless, something's up, and the odds are pretty slim it will be something we like. I cringed as Votstag shouted some of his garbled nonsense back towards Lowell. Yes, I know we're not being paid to have fun, but we're not being paid at all. Klaus interrupted. None of us are getting any real money until our contracts are up, and have any of you actually known anyone who made it to the end of their contract? He recoiled as Votstag spun around and began roaring at him, hot spittle flying out from beneath his mask of carved bone as he furiously waved his fist in his face. He's right, Klaus. You're being paranoid, Vincent said in an eerily calm tone. I've served out multiple contracts, and I've got the silver to prove it. He confidently reached into his pocket and held a troy-ounce coin of sea lice silver between his fingers. Fish and chips, the pair of 3 foot tall, somethings that worked for us immediately crowded around him and began eyeing it greedily. That's right, boys, take a gander. That's powerful magic right there, and you'll get one of these for every moon you've worked at the end of your contracts, he reminded us before quickly pocketing the coin away again. Unless, of course, you do something to get your contract prematurely terminated, then you'll have nothing to show for it but a fistful of expired script. So keep your heads down, mouth shut, and your eyes on the prize. You'll have pockets jangling full of coins soon enough. As discreetly as I could, I slipped my hands into my pockets and rubbed my 1 sea lice coin for good luck. None of them knew I had it, because I didn't want to explain how I got it, but that little bit of fortune it brought me had almost been enough to let me escape once. If I could just muster up the skill to make the best use of my luck, it would be enough to get me out for good one day. The freight elevator finally came to a stop, and the doors creaked open to reveal the spacious and sumptuous penthouse of our employer. Portraits, animal heads, shields, weapons, and most of all masquerade masks covered nearly every square inch of the walls. Amidst the suits of armor and porcelain vases, there were dozens of priceless ornaments strewn throughout the room. They were incredibly tempting to steal, which was their whole point. Stealing from the boss was a violation of your contract, and you did not want to break your contract. The wide windows on the far wall offered a panoramic view of our decaying company town, nestled in a valley between sharp crimson mountains beneath a xanthous sky twinkling with 1,000 black stars. You may have heard of such a place before. It has many names, but I will speak none of them here. Ignazio was sitting on a reclining couch in front of the fireplace, some paperwork left out on the coffee table and a featureless mask like a silver spiderweb clutched in his hand. Ignazio himself always wore the top half of a golden oni mask, which in and of itself wasn't unusual for our company, but the odd thing was that several portraits in the penthouse showed that it had once been a full mask. I've always wondered what happened to the bottom half. Aside from that, Ignazio wasn't too unusual looking. He was tall, skinny, and swarthy with a pronounced chin, tousled dark brown hair, and always dressed in doublets of silk and velvet like he was performing Shakespeare or something. Vothstag went into the room first, with Vincent almost, but not quite, at his side. Fish and Chips scamped after them, followed by Lowald, Klaus, and myself. The last two members of our crew are called Ham and Gristle, and they're the two I know the least about. They keep to themselves, and I don't think I've ever even seen them with their masks off. I have seen them without gloves on though, and both of their hands are white with pink-tinged fingers. I have no idea what that means, but for some reason, I always found it oddly unsettling. The only thing I know for sure about them is that they're the only survivors of another crew that tried to run out on their contract, and I know better than to ask for details about that. Gentlemen, right on time, Ignazio greeted us as he waved us over. He positioned himself on his couch to make it impossible for any of us to sit beside him, and none of us dared to take a seat at any of the clawfoot armchairs that were meant for guests with much higher stations in life. I've got this moon's script books all stamped and approved. You'll notice they're a bit light, seeing as how you were slightly behind quota on this assignment. None of us objected, and none of us were particularly surprised. I was grateful that the mask hid my expression, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one. I still had to make an effort to mind my body language though. Being so accustomed to his employees and compatriots wearing masks, Ignazio was quite astute to body language. Vincent accepted the stack of 9 booklets and nodded gratefully. We appreciate your leniency, my lord, and look forward to earning back our privileges on our next assignment, he said. I was hoping you'd say that. Ignazio grinned as he took a sip from his crystal chalice. He set it down on the coffee table and picked up a dossier. Halloween is fast approaching, and that means we need costumes and candy. Costumes we have in abundance, obviously, but candy's one vice I don't usually keep well stocked. So we're actually stealing candy from babies on our next job? Klaus asked. Nothing so quotidian, Ignazio sneered. Remind me, have any of you met Icky before? The name meant nothing to me, but I glanced from side to side to see if anyone else reacted to it. I could have sworn I saw Ham and Gristle perk their heads up slightly. She's that clown woman, right? The one in charge of that god-awful circus? Vincent asked. I beg your pardon? It's an enchanted circus that travels the worlds and offers sanctuary to paranormal vagabonds in need, Ignazio claimed half-heartedly. And I might be able to pawn a few of you off on them if it comes to that, so be careful you don't fall any further behind on your quotas. But you're right, she is a clown, with a capital C, and clowns love candy. She'll be attending my All Hallows Ball this year, and I don't want her to feel excluded, so we'll need some real top-shelf candy on offer. Ah, we're still waiting for the other shoe to drop here, boss, Vincent confessed as most of us shared nervous glances with one another. You want us to get candy? Fancy candy? I I don't get it. What's the catch? Oh God, we're not taking it from babies. We're serving the babies with it. Lowald balked in horror. No, but thank you for that highball to make the actual assignment seem more reasonable, Ignacio said. No, I'm sending you all down to the taproots of the World Tree to collect some of the crystallized sap there. The taproots of the World Tree? Vincent repeated softly. The physical manifestation of the metaphysical network that binds all the worlds and planes of creation, knotted by the knot things trying to break their way into reality? You're sending us down there, for sweets? Icky swears that Yggdrasil syrup pairs beautifully with French toast, he replied blithely. This is an especially dangerous assignment, so I want you all to read that dossier in full. Emrys has been charting and forging new pathways through the plains from his spire in Adderwood, so thanks to him your trip down at least will be relatively easy. Just there and back, right? Vincent asked desperately, his voice wavering. Just a handful of the stuff to Wowiki, and we're done, right? A sadistic smirk slowly spread across Ignacio's face before he told us how much crystallized sap we would need to retrieve. You mine 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older, and deeper in debt, Lowald sang as he chipped away at the pulsing amber crystal emerging from the Leviathan root. The World Tree was cosmically colossal, though it's meaningless to describe its size since I can only describe the parts of it that exist in 3 dimensions. The twin trunks of the tree snaked around each other like a double helix, each alight with an ever-shifting astral aura that perpetually waxed and waned in synchronicity with its twin. From its crown sprung a seemingly infinite mass of fractally dividing branches, shimmering with countless spherical leaves which I knew to be individual universes. The base of the tree spawned an equally infinite mass of sprawling taproots, anchoring it in place and drawing precious sustenance from the edges of reality. As dangerous as it was to be there, it was nonetheless a sublime experience. You think that looking upon all of existence like that would fill you with Lovecraftian madness at your own insignificance, but it was far more transcendental than that. On some fundamental level, I recognized that tree. It was Yggdrasil. It was the biblical tree of good and evil. It was the 2 trees of Valinor. That tree was meant to be there, and so was everything inside of it. Sure, it was functionally infinite and everything in it was finite, but the tree wasn't merely massive, it was intricate. In the grand scheme of things, nothing inside of it was superfluous. Everything, no matter its scale, was part of the ultimate design of the tree. You and I may not be any more important than anyone or anything else, but if we weren't important, we wouldn't be here. I'm not entirely sure if any of my coworkers felt the same way though. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go, Lowald continued to sing, only to be interrupted by Vothstag's irate howling, his eyes burning like coals as he dared him to finish the chorus. Lowald bowed his head contritely as he awkwardly cleared his throat. When Vothstag was satisfied he had been cowed into silence, he turned around to resume his work. "'Cause I owe my soul to the company store," I finished for him, not too loudly, but loud enough that everyone heard me. Vothstag immediately came charging at me, roaring in fury, but I didn't flinch. I just let him chew me out for about a minute until I heard something that I was pretty sure was a question. "That's ridiculous. You're making more noise than either of us," I countered. "And wasting more time. Now, if you don't mind, I've got work to do." Vothstag sneered at me, but since I had resumed my task, his job as taskmaster was complete, and he left to attend to other matters. "What the hell are you doing, pushing your luck like that, Brendan?" Vincent whispered. He was out of line. "Even chain gangs are allowed to sing," I explained. "Besides, I'm right, aren't I? If we attract any unwanted attention, it will be because of him." This isn't the place to cause trouble, he hissed. Fill the carts as fast as you can so we can get out of here. When we arrived at the taproots, we saw that we weren't the first beings to try to mine this deposit of sap. Someone, likely some clan of Unseelie Fae, had established a fairly complex operation with rails and hand carts. As convenient as this was for us, it did of course pose the uncomfortable question of why the site had been completely abandoned when it was obviously far from depleted. Me, Vincent, Lowbald, and Klaus were chipping away at the crystal sap, tossing what we could into a nearby trolley cart. When it was full, Ham and Gristle would haul it off so that Fish and Chips could scoop it into 20-kilogram bags, which Ham and Gristle would then stack and secure onto skids. And as always, Botstag supervised. 16 bleeding tons of this bilge, Vincent muttered as he took a swing at it with his pickaxe. And he's got the nerve to tell us it's just an appetizer for a party guest. What do you suppose they're going to do with it all? Refine it into proper syrup, I imagine, Lowald replied. Make it into sweets and sodas, or just drizzle some of it straight onto flapjacks. Either way, they'll make a killing. 16 tons will probably sell for millions. Why though? Is it just exotic sugar? I asked. What do you think? Lowald asked rhetorically, gesturing at the source. For reality benders, anything from the edges of reality is potent stuff. They put a lump of this in their morning coffee, and the veil will seem as weak to them as it is here. There's no telling what havoc they'll get up to, so you better hope we're not around to see. Now you're just being ridiculous. Clowns don't drink coffee, Vincent joked. I was about to ask him how he would know, when Botstag put his hand on my shoulder and spun me around. Ham and Gristle had returned with the empty cart, but only Gristle was getting ready to pull the full one. Botstag spewed some of his usual gibberish, gesturing at me and then towards Ham's empty space at the cart. Because I sang one line? Seriously? I asked. I was about to throw Lowald under the bus for singing in the first place, but Botstag was already roaring incomprehensibly. All right. I'll pull the damn cart. I handed my pickaxe over to Ham, who instantly began swinging at the sap with manic enthusiasm. Gristle gave me a slight nod of condolence before Botstag yoked me up to the cart like an ox and then sent us on our way with an angry shout. If you don't mind me asking, how come Ham deserves a break and you don't? I asked Gristle as we made our way down the track, the dinging of our colleagues' pickaxes slowly fading into the background. Gristle looked over his shoulder to confirm the Botstag was well out of earshot, and then turned his head towards mine. Vincent's wrong, you know, he said in a soft, conspiratorial whisper. Oh. I'm sorry? I asked. About clowns and coffee, he clarified. Icky drinks coffee. I've seen her do it. She takes it with double cream and sugar to keep it clown kosher, of course. She's a little too classy to indulge in stereotypical candy binges, but she's still got a sweet tooth like the rest of us. Us? I asked uneasily. Gristle nodded, lifting up his gas mask by the filter and revealing his face to me for the first time. His poreless skin was a lustrous white, but his lips, nose, and the space around his eyes were all pitch black, and the eyes themselves sparkled with the light of 1,000 dying stars. His mouth was spread into an unnaturally wide smile, revealing that his teeth were not only perfect but shiny to the point that I could see myself in them. And I looked terrified. Lowald was right though, about what this stuff will do to us, he went on. Once everything's fully loaded, Ham and I are going to take a mouthful each and then take the whole haul for ourselves. We'll stash some of it away somewhere safe, then use the rest to buy our way back into the circus. The only problem is getting there. That's where you come in. What are you on about? How can I possibly help you get back to your circus? I asked. With that Seelie coin you got in your pocket, he said, lowering his voice so that I only barely heard him. These carts weren't meant to be powered manually, you know. They run on fairy magic, and that coin's got enough that we can drive all 16 tons of our loot to anywhere in the world we want. I briefly considered denying that I even had the coin, but if he was determined, he could find and take it easily enough, so there really wasn't any point. Ignoring for the moment how you even know I have that, why not ask Vincent? I suggested. He's got way more Seelie silver than I do. He doesn't want out. You do, Gristle responded. You tried to escape once, and I know you're just itching for a chance to try again. But Ignazio knows what you are, doesn't he? He wouldn't have let you around the sap if he wasn't prepared for you to try to take some, I said. He doesn't know Ham and I can take our masks off without his say-so, Gristle explained. We've been living off meager rations of powdered milk to keep us in line, but we were able to get a hold of a bottle of the fresh stuff and chugged it before we came here. Ignazio and Votstag have no power over us right now. I'm sorry, milk? I asked, confused. Not important at the moment. Are you in or not? He asked. I considered his proposition for a moment, deciding on one final question before answering. Why not just take the coin from me? Because I'm a nice guy, he said with a sickeningly wide grin. And stealing Seelie silver tends not to end well. I don't need an answer now. The load's not full yet. Think about it, and when the time comes, do whatever you've got to do. He pulled his mask back down, and we finished hauling the cart over to Fish and Chips in silence. He wasn't wrong about me wanting to escape, but my plan had always been to quietly sneak off and be long gone before anyone noticed. A fight between Votstag and a pair of superpowered clowns followed by a daring getaway on an unseelie mining cart was a bit riskier than anything I had envisioned. But at the same time, this was an unprecedented opportunity that would likely never come again. From the taproots of the World Tree, I could go literally anywhere and never have to worry about Ignazio or his minions tracking me down. All it would cost me was the single coin I had to my name. I hauled the cart with Gristle for the rest of the shift. Eventually, we had a train of 16 pallets, each loaded with 50 20-kilogram sacks of crystallized sap. That's it then. Orders full, Vincent declared as he walked the length of the train, testing the chains to make sure the cargo was fully secured. All of you hop in the front and let's get the hell out of here. Votstag roared in disagreement, standing between us and the cart and making a vaguely groping gesture. Right. Contraband check. Vincent nodded with a weary sigh as he outstretched his arms. Nothing too invasive now, you hear? If this stuff was inside of us, you'd already know it. Votstag didn't acknowledge his comment, but proceeded to pat him down and empty his pockets. Ham and Gristle each gave me a knowing look. If I did nothing, Votstag would find my coin and it would all be over for me anyway. I nodded my assent and braced myself for the worst. With a single swift motion, Ham and Gristle each pulled their masks off, and the visages of the two monstrous clowns were enough to throw all of us into immediate pandemonium. Ham's hair, eyes, lips, and nose were all a fiery red, and I saw now that the tips of their ears had a pink tinge, just like their fingers. The instant their masks were off, they wasted no time shoveling a handful of crystal sap into their mouths. Votstag howled and charged straight at them, and everyone else scattered as quickly as they could to avoid being bulldozed by the massive deer man. Ham and Gristle stood their ground, each of them grabbing a hold of one of his antlers. Despite his size and speed, Votstag was brought to a dead stop. He snorted and bellowed as he tried to force himself forward, but he was completely unable to overpower the two clowns. Ham and Gristle exchanged sinister smiles and began to spin Votstag around and around. Within seconds his feet were off the ground, and with each rotation, he gained more and more momentum until his attackers finally let go of his antlers and sent him flying into the distance. "The rest of you, stay out of our way!" Gristle shouted as he marched towards the front cart, grabbing me by the scruff of my jacket and pulling me along with him. "Wait, why? Why can't they come? Why can't we all go?" I protested. "We don't know what half these freaks are and we don't trust them," he said as he tossed me onto the cart. "Now drive. Go straight until I say otherwise." I looked out at my confused and frightened companions and took a bit of solace in the fact that they weren't entirely certain if I had betrayed them or if I was just being kidnapped. I hesitated for a moment, but Ham's sharp talons digging into my shoulder were enough to press me into action. With my coin of Seali's silver clutched in my right palm, I grabbed a firm hold of the driving shaft and pushed the train forward. It accelerated at a remarkable pace, and before I knew it, we were speeding away from our work site and towards freedom. "It's working! It's actually working," Gristle laughed in relief. "Even Votstag can't run this fast," Ham declared triumphantly. "The whole haul is ours. We're rich. We're free." I wanted to celebrate with them. I really did. But deep down inside I knew we weren't out of the woods yet. "You guys read that dossier Iggy gave us, right?" I asked. "The knot things that gnaw the taproots are attracted to ontological anchors, anything that's more real than its surroundings. If you guys are reality benders, and you just ate a massive power-up, doesn't that make you the realest things here? Isn't that cute?" "He thinks he knows more about ontodynamics than us because he read a dossier," Ham scoffed. "This isn't our first time on the fringes of the unreal, boy," Gristle replied. "You just drive this train, and let us worry about." Without warning, the taproot split open ahead of us into a fuming, festering chasm. The ground quake was enough to completely derail the train, and I ducked and rolled while I had the chance. When I came out of the roll, I looked up to see a titanic, disfigured, and disembodied head rising out of the chasm. The size and proportions of the entity fluctuated wildly, as if I was only looking at the three-dimensional facets of it like the world tree itself. It was encrusted with some kind of dark barnacles, and anything that wasn't its face was covered in thousands of squirming and feathery tentacles of every conceivable length. It had no nose, but several mouths which chanted backwards-sounding words in synchronicity with each other, dropping rotting black teeth every time they opened and closed. There were 6 randomly spaced and variously sized eyeballs darting around independently of each other, each glowing with a sickly yellow light. I was paralyzed in fear, terrified that the knot thing would see me, but all 6 of its eyes soon locked onto Ham and Gristle. As it slowly ascended upwards like a hot air balloon, a pair of flickering tongues shot out of 2 of its mouths with predatory intent. The clowns were scooped up like flies, screaming as they were whisked back into the knot thing's cavernous maws. I don't know much about clowns or what they're capable of, only that Ham and Gristle never got a chance to test their mettle against this behemoth. A few chomps of its black teeth, and it was all over. I sat there in silence, watching as the knot thing continued to drift away, never daring to assume that it had forgotten about me. "Brandon!" I heard a voice call from the distance. I was finally able to pull my eyes off the knot thing, and when I looked down the track, I saw the rest of my crew hurrying towards me, which included a very angry Votstag. Grabbing me by the jacket and lifting me off the ground, he roared furiously in my face, demanding answers. "Easy, Votstag, easy," Vincent insisted. "They just grabbed the kid. It wasn't his idea." Votstag growled skeptically, eyeing the toppled train beside us. He knew it could have only been driven like that by sea lion magic, and I still had my lucky coin clutched tightly in my right hand. Ham must have picked my pocket when he was working alongside us, Vincent suggested. I knew he didn't really think that. He knew exactly how many coins he had, and he knew he wasn't missing any. I don't know why he covered for me, but I owe him big. Serves him right, too. Bloody idiot, he said with a sad shake of his head as he surveyed the wreckage. Let this be a lesson for all of you if you ever think about stealing my sea lice silver. That's right, fish and chips, I'm looking at you. Vothstag howled again, clearly unconvinced. They took me as a driver so that they could stay focused on defending the train. I claimed. If I hadn't jumped when I did, they may have stood a chance against that giant floating head. I saved our hull. Vothstag snorted in contempt, but set me back on my feet. I don't think he believed me, really, but he knew that Ignazio wouldn't hold him blameless in this little debacle either, so it was in all of our best interests not to cast aspersions on one another's stories. Listen up, everybody. We're 2 men down and we've got to get this rig back on the track before some other unspeakable abomination comes along, so get moving. Vincent ordered. For once, Vothstag was doing most of the work, using his mic to set the carts back on the tracks, while the rest of us just picked up any sacks of sap that had come loose. What a bloody joke, Lowald grumbled as he threw a sack onto a cart. Down from 9 to 7, any of us could still die at any minute, and for what? We mined 16 tons, and what do we get? Another day older, I agreed, throwing another sack next to his. But some days, that's enough. In being hunted by a clown doll. I settled into my new job as a babysitter, eager to earn some extra cash. The Johnsons had a beautiful home, filled with vibrant colors and playful decor. But it was the large clown doll in the corner of the living room that caught my attention. Standing nearly 4 feet tall, it wore a garish costume of bright red, blue, and yellow, and its painted smile sent a shiver down my spine. Isn't he adorable? Mrs. Johnson said, noticing my lingering gaze. That's Chuckles. He's been in the family for generations. I forced a smile, though my stomach churned. There was something about the doll that felt off, almost sinister. After the parents left for their night out, I settled on the couch with the 2 kids, hoping to distract myself from Chuckles. We watched cartoons, laughter filling the air, but as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Chuckles was watching me. Can we play hide and seek? One of the kids asked, their eyes sparkling with excitement. Sure. You count, and I'll hide, I replied, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. As the children counted, I ducked into a nearby closet, squeezing into the cramped space. The air was dark and musty, and I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. The muffled sounds of their giggles faded, replaced by the thumping of my heart. Suddenly, I heard a noise from the living room, a faint rustling sound. Had Chuckles moved? Pushing the thought aside, I focused on the game, but when the kids found me, they looked pale. Samantha, the clown, he's not in the corner anymore, one of them whispered, eyes wide with fear. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I asked, emerging from the closet. Where is he? I don't know, the other child replied, trembling. He was just standing there, and now he's gone. Panic surged in my chest. Stay here, I instructed, trying to sound calm. I peered into the living room, scanning the shadows for any sign of Chuckles. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Just then, I heard a creaking sound from behind me. I spun around, my breath hitching. Chuckles was standing in the doorway, his painted grin more sinister than before. For a moment, it felt like his eyes were locked onto mine, piercing and unblinking. "Guys!" I yelled, retreating slowly. "Get behind me!" The children scrambled to my side, their faces etched with fear. But before I could react, the doll moved, lumbering forward as if it were alive. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed a nearby lamp, ready to defend the kids. "Stay back!" I shouted, raising the lamp like a weapon. But Chuckles didn't stop. He took another step closer, his smile grotesque, stretching wider. In that moment, the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. My heart raced as I swung the lamp, missing as the doll lunged forward. I could feel cold, plastic fingers grasping at me, and I cried out, shoving the lamp into the doll's chest. It toppled backward with a thud, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. "Run!" I screamed at the kids, pushing them toward the front door. They bolted past me, but as I turned to follow, I felt a grip on my ankle. Looking down, I saw Chuckles pulling himself back up, the painted smile now twisted into something monstrous. Panic surged through me as I kicked free and sprinted after the children. We reached the front door, and I fumbled with the lock, praying it would turn. Behind me, I could hear the soft padding of the doll's movements, relentless and chilling. Finally, the door clicked open, and we tumbled out into the night. "Call the police!" I yelled, pulling out my phone. But as I turned to look back, I realized Chuckles was no longer there. The night felt still, almost too quiet. When the police arrived, they searched the house but found no sign of the doll. It was as if Chuckles had vanished into thin air. The Johnsons returned, confused by the chaos, and I explained what had happened. "That doll has been a part of our family for years," Mrs. Johnson said, a frown creasing her brow. "It can't move on its own." But I knew better. As I left the house, I glanced back at the living room window. There, behind the curtains, I swore I could see the outline of Chuckles, watching, waiting. The laughter of children echoed in my mind, mingling with the sinister grin of the clown. My pulse quickened as I got into my car, thoughts racing. What if I hadn't been able to protect the kids? The weight of the encounter pressed down on me, a suffocating dread that refused to let go. Driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I glanced in the rearview mirror more than once, half expecting to see Chuckles grinning back, his painted smile a chilling reminder of what had just happened. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the image of the clown doll haunted me. I tried to tell myself it was just a toy, nothing more than a relic of childhood. But the way it had moved, the way it had looked at me. No, it felt all too real. Sleep eluded me, the shadows in my room twisting into grotesque shapes. Just as I began to drift off, a soft creaking noise pulled me back to consciousness. My heart raced. I held my breath, listening intently. Then I heard it, a faint giggle, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling. My blood ran cold. I crept to the door, heart pounding in my chest, and peeked out into the hallway. It was dark, but I swore I could see a shape at the end, just beyond the light. My pulse quickened as I took a step forward, then froze. The unmistakable outline of Chuckles stood there, backlit by the dim light of the street lamp outside. He was just standing there, watching. I stumbled back, scrambling for my phone to call for help. But before I could dial, the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging me into darkness. The giggles grew louder, echoing through the empty house. With a surge of adrenaline, I ran for the front door, desperately fumbling for the lock. But as I turned the handle, I felt a cold hand grasp my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around to face the thing I had feared all night. Chuckles stood there, closer than ever, his painted grin now twisted into a horrifying sneer. The laughter of the children morphed into something menacing, and I realized with dawning horror that I was not just being watched, I was being hunted. As I finally broke free and burst outside into the night, I knew I hadn't escaped the terror of Chuckles. The laughter still echoed in my ears, a haunting reminder that some toys are not meant to be played with, and some nightmares never truly end.